It's important to understand what the literature really has to say and not what best-selling authors may suggest as the conclusions of the research.
This is WorkSpan TV and I'm Marsha Rhodes. Today's segment is about myths and realities in total rewards. And with me is Jerry Ledford from the Center for Effective Organizations at the University of Southern California. Jerry, I've heard you assert that the total rewards field is filled with deeply held beliefs that have little support in research.
Let me give you three. So one is you hear over and over again from managers that a happy worker is a productive worker. Well, a happy worker sometimes is productive and some happy workers are not very productive. Some of the most productive people around are pretty unhappy. So there's no direct relationship. It all depends on whether they're motivated. Another myth you hear over and over again is the old saw from Fred Hertzberg that money is a hygiene factor, not a motivator. Nobody's believed that in academia for decades. Nobody does studies of Hertzberg's model. It's pretty well established that money actually does motivate. The last is the current favorite. It's Dan Pink, Alfie Kohn, Kennard, that intrinsic motivation is damaged by extrinsic rewards to such a degree that it makes money rewards, extrinsic rewards, ineffective. We have an article in the current issue of the Journal that looks at that in detail, indicating it's just not the case.
Let's set the record straight on one of those three myths, the myth that incentives do not motivate performance. What can you tell us about that?
I looked at all the reviews of literature in the last 20 years and a few golden oldies, and every one of them is completely consistent. Money motivates, and to a pretty significant degree. There are questions about how much it motivates and how much money is enough and so forth. But every review of the literature is consistent. Money motivates and motivates pretty significantly.
Can you tell us what types of organizations benefit the most from incentives?
Most organizations can benefit from incentives of some type. In some organizations, individual incentives will be best. In other organizations, it may be a team or an organization level incentive like team incentives or profit sharing or whatever, depending on where you measure performance most effectively in the organization. The types of organizations that tend not to benefit from incentives are ones where you can't measure performance well enough to reward it. Research and development labs, for example. It can be very hard to reward performance because it's on such a long cycle. It may take 10 years to develop a new pharmaceutical product, for example.
As a follow-up to that, what types of employees benefit from incentives?
One of the things I think that's often underestimated is that in the American economy, people like pay for performance. Not everybody does, but most employees do. And people tend to leave organizations that don't offer it, unless they're in the group that would prefer security over opportunity, that would prefer stability over the chance for earning more. You tend to find, in fact, people who would prefer no pay for performance in the types of organizations that tend not to offer it, like government. But most employees, if given the chance, would prefer pay for performance, and they'll go to organizations that offer it.
Jerry, you said earlier that it's a myth that a happy worker is a productive worker. Can you tell us more about that?
But there's no direct connection, the correlation between happiness in any way that it's measured, from satisfaction to more direct measures of happiness, and performance is very weak. What is strong is a connection between a motivational model, understanding that what I do leads to a level of performance that's rewarded and in turn gives me a reward that I value. If they see that, they'll be more happy because they get the reward, but they'll also perform better. Just making them happy without creating those links usually is not effective. It just increases expense.
You also said that it's a myth that money is a hygiene factor. Can you elaborate on that?
What people have forgotten about Fred Hertzberg is that he's the father of job enrichment. And in the late 50s and early 60s, when he was the most active, we were in an era when old-fashioned Skinnerian conditioning was the most in favor. And he was arguing for focusing on intrinsic factors, like the way the work is constructed, to make it interesting and rewarding to do. And rewards were his foil, because that was the primary thing that was used by people who were operant conditioners. However, if you actually looked at Fred's data, it didn't show that money was only a hygiene factor. If you actually go back to his studies and looked at the data, about half the time it was a motivator and half the time it was a hygiene factor. So why did it get classified as a hygiene factor? Because it was a good foil to job enrichment, which is what he was promoting.
Jerry, in closing, what's the key takeaway for our viewers?
There are plenty of opportunities for practitioners to benefit from research that's been done over the last 5 decades on rewards in organizations. It's important to understand what the literature really has to say. That can require partnership between academics and practitioners to make sure we're being appropriately guided by what the findings really have to say, and not what best-selling authors may suggest as the conclusions of the research.
Well said. That was Jerry Ledford from the University of Southern California. For World at Work, I'm Marsha Rhodes.